Okay, so if we can start off with your name, date, and place of birth, as well as your current status, please.
My name is Dennis Wood. I was born in July 1947 in West Bromwich, West Midlands. I'm currently Emeritus Professor of French Literature at the University of Birmingham.
That sounds getting worse.
Is it?
It feels like it, yeah. Anyway, okay. We'll just keep going. Can you tell me a little bit about your background? How you were brought up, what sort of education you had, your family, that sort of.
I went to a Catholic grammar school. My father worked in. My parents were working class. He worked in the office of a steel tube factory in the Black Country on the outskirts of Birmingham. After grammar school, I went to King's College London to read French. Part of the course was a year in France, spent as a teacher in a school, as a colloquial assistant. So in my third year, that is in September 1967, I went to Paris, and for a year, well, it turned out to be rather less than a year, I was colloquial assistant at the Lycée Claude Bernard in a rather posh area of Paris, 16th arrondissement. And I was not alone. There were about another 8 students from King's College London in Paris, and we met up regularly, went to the cinema, went to bars, and so
on. And had you had any experience of spending long periods of time in France prior to this, or was this your first real?
It was the first trip didn't really count. It was 10 days in a Paris lycée, the Easter before I went to university. On a language course, which was great fun, and obviously I had a rather rosy view of what Paris is actually like.
Okay, so prior to this experience in France in 1968, had you had any experience of political or social activism?
No, and I have to say none of the people I was in Paris with had either. We were all, shall we say, Labour Party, Harold Wilson. It was normal, what students felt normally in those days. No, I don't think there was one of our number who chose to get a flat in Belleville to be amongst the Arab community. He was fairly radical, but apart from that, no, I can't say there was anything particularly political about us.
Okay, and both from a French perspective and an international perspective, were there any signs in the run-up from your own perspective, any signs that things were happening, there was something coming?
I have to say none at all. I read the newspapers, I listened to the radio, I've always been a news freak. So I knew exactly what was going on. I listened to English radio as well. Nothing at all. I'd like to say there were straws in the wind, but there really weren't. I mean, there was the usual political ferment in France on the streets. There were demonstrations about Vietnam, as indeed there were in London, where I'd just been. But there was nothing particularly significant. There was ferment out at Nanterre. I knew that, and it was in all the newspapers. And eventually, of course, that moved across to the Latin Quarter. But no, the first sign of anything is rather strange. On the 1st of May, I was sitting in a cafe on a terrace on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. And on the 1st of May, it's traditional to give little posies of lily of the valley to your loved one. There was a student who'd got a tray of these, and he came along and was selling them. And he went up to a guy who was reading, I think, the Figaro, dressed like an office worker in a suit. And there was the most amazing altercation between them. You know, the entire cafe turned around to see what was going on. And the student launched into an incredible tirade about capitalism and, you know, that kind of thing. And then went off. the guy stood up and said, you know, "Je vous ai demandé quelque chose, you know, well, why do you come, you know, bothering me?" And that was it. I thought this was very strange. You know, it's lodged in my consciousness ever since. The only other thing was that coming from a Catholic background, I had a friend, very extremely clever, who was at the École Normale Supérieure. He was a friend of a friend who'd been at Oxford. And I used to go out, well, I went a couple of times to the École Normale at Saint-Cloud, and there was a Catholic discussion group, very high-powered, very serious, a little bit out of place. And they were discussing la droiture, the nature of being an upright man in the Old and New Testament. And then at the end of it all, there was a collection for bicycles for the FLN, you know, the Viet Cong, which seemed to be absolutely normal. This is the thing they always did, and they were absolutely solid behind the FLN. Again, this is just part of the background, but nothing particularly significant. No, the first thing that happened to me was when my lycée was occupied. Shall I tell you about that? I rolled up.
If we just pause 1 second, let's see if we put this thing on the floor. Before we get into the details of the events themselves, I mean, we talked about how we weren't aware of any real changes or signs of things coming politically. From a more cultural or social perspective, was there a sense that there was a generational change going on, musically, fashion, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I came from London. You know, I just spent 2 years in Swinging London. You know, I've been to folk clubs, marquee club, tiles. You know, I was crazy about pop music. You know, Hendrix, Cream, Stones, and all that sort of thing. And France, when I got there, it was a hell of a wrench. It was so backward. It was so conservative with a small C. It was formal. It seemed very, very strongly family-centered. Backward, I think I could say. And you know, it was, as I said, it was a big wrench. I mean, Paris is, of course, as we know, a wonderful city, fantastically cultured. I was only 20, and you know, I felt that I'd come to a backwater really compared to London. And likewise in the school, I taught in this rather posh lycée. Everything was as I imagine it had been back in the 1950s. You know, it was well disciplined. There are good and bad sides, aren't there? I never had the slightest problem with the kids, and I taught them from about 11 up to 17 or 18. The 17 or 18-year-olds were where you would look for, signs of ferment, but there weren't any. We used to go across the street to the Café des Deux Stades. We were very near to the Parc des Princes. And we'd sit there for an hour or so and talk about life and their girlfriends and all that. And there was never a single hint of what's going to happen. I keep looking back and I just can't see it.
Yeah. Well, what did you think of the education system?
Pretty good. It was, I had no problems with it at all. As I said, I taught both ends. My physical problem was getting there because I lived up by the Gare du Nord, and I had to get down there on the metro and change and rush hour and be there by 8:30 and bright and bushy-tailed, and that was quite hard. But no, the staff were very friendly. The English department, I knew that the German assistant, who was an absolute scream, and drove a Volkswagen, and we went off to the park occasionally, and I mean that was great. No, it was a well-run traditional school. The only problem was they hadn't really got enough work for me, or work at the right time of day. There was stuff at 8:30 in the morning, and there was stuff in late afternoon. But no hint of any, creaking or cracking in the school or in the system.
Okay, so how did you start to experience the events then when things start to kick off?
It all happened on Friday, the 10th of May. There'd been things going on before, obviously, in connection with Nanterre and the students who'd been arrested and what had been going on around the Sorbonne. Of course, I was perfectly aware of this. When I got to the school at 8:30, the place had been occupied. You know, occupation des locaux. I think there was a banner in front of on the front of the school, which looks exactly as it did then. If you look at it on Google Earth. And outside there were students, school students, milling around. And I walked towards the glass door, as I always did, and my way was blocked. And suddenly there were a group of students, in a very friendly way, doing sort of ringa roses around me, holding hands, saying, "Les profs avec nous, les profs avec nous." So I said, "Moi je veux bien," you know, okay. And I went away. I mean, my concern was, you know, I was not turning up for my classes, you know, but of course the school was occupied. This was a completely new situation and like nothing I'd ever experienced before. So I went home and brooded, you know, will I get into trouble for this? But of course I didn't get into trouble because the place was closed indefinitely. That night there was a massive riot. I think it was, is it called the Nuit des Barricades? I mean, there'd been things going on before, of course, confrontations with the police, massive violence on both sides. You know, one shouldn't underestimate police violence in France, the CRS and the ordinary police. And the next day, I met my friends. The metro must still have been working. I've got a diary here with everything I did. And we met at the Odeon and went up and saw the total devastation. You know, trees sawn down, cars burnt out, shop windows smashed, and tear gas in the air. And we went to the place where we normally ate, which was the South Service Latin Cuny at the intersection of Saint-Germain and Boulevard Saint-Michel. And we were, in fact, I think when we came out, we were chased by the riot police, which is not a very pleasant experience. You suddenly see a mass of people coming around a corner, a blind corner, and running towards you. And I mean, you don't even think, you just run in front of them away from the riot police. And I mean, that's when it all began, of course. On the Monday, this was the Saturday, on the Monday, I did go to the cinema that night, by the way. Things were still relatively normal. We went to see Bergman's Persona, which I thought was wonderful. And then on the Monday, it was the general strike. And there were, you know, obviously a massive, Monday the 13th, was it? Massive presence of people on the streets. And gradually in the course of that week, more and more things weren't working, so that by the Saturday, the 18th, something like that, there was nothing. There were no trains, there were no planes, there was no transport of any kind. The banks were closed, there were queues in the shops, there were queues for fuel, and there was actually no way of getting around Paris, which is a pretty vast city, other than on foot. So I walked from where I was up near Poissonnière metro station to the Latin Quarter to meet my friends that Saturday. And I think by then the Odeon had been occupied and there was a permanent debate, whatever you want to call it, with people coming and going, you know, workmen, actors, famous people. It was a very long walk, about 4 or 5 miles, and then that was the Saturday. This may sound utterly trivial, when West Bromwich Albion beat Everton 1-0, and we went back to a friend of mine's, 8 of us, named Lucy, who herself has written a novel about Paris in '68, Lucy Fornalski, Lucy Floyd. And we listened to this this football match. But I said in my diary, can I just quote you what I said about that Saturday the 18th, how we felt. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, sat at Lucy's, miserable. My team had just won. Walked home. And that was about, as I said, probably 6 miles from where she lived. She lived somewhere by Les Invalides. And that was it. From then on, I had no money. The banks were closed. I was at Barclays Bank on the Avenue Kléber, near where the Vietnam preliminary talks were taking place. And eventually that closed. And the only way I kept going was by giving private English lessons, as I had for months, to a woman psychiatrist in Passy. And I had to get there on foot from England. So I must be incredibly fit.
Did you?
Sorry, I'm digressing a bit, Chris, but
that's what we want. That's exactly the type of material that I like to hear. Did you become involved in any way? Did you contribute to any of this?
Not really, no. I mean, I was exhilarated. You know, nobody. I mean, being sort of on the left, as it were, I thought this is, and knowing what was going on in the universities, I didn't register for the Sorbonne, although friends did. But I knew the place was overcrowded, universities were overcrowded, students were treated with ill-concealed contempt, shall we say. It was not the rather cosy world of an English university at all. And I felt real sympathy. Something must change. So that was one's first experience. Then it got a bit more worrying and a bit more frightening pretty fast. It was really the general strike when the workers joined in, and you realised you were totally stuck with no money, no way to get out, for the foreseeable future, and it looked as though it was going to go on for months. That's when the smile went off my face.
And did you make an attempt to go back to the school during the events at all?
I didn't, no. That really would have been a walk, probably about 10 miles. No, I didn't. Shall I run to the end of the tale? At the end of the tale, when I finally went back, when everything was over, in June, the intendant of the school, I went to see him, and he said, "You deserted your post." He was extremely aggressive. Which made me a bit aggressive, I have to say. I mean, I presume he deserted his post as well, since the school was shut. We argued and argued. In the end, he gave me my money for June and July. But that was rather unpleasant. I mean, there really was, you were helpless, completely helpless if you couldn't get about. And there was no transport. Yeah, money was a problem. As I said, my bank was closed and presumably occupied. And it was walking to Passy and teaching English lessons to a woman psychiatrist who had a wall safe and gave me cash. And I could walk back and buy some chips. That was what kept me going, I have to say.
And did you not go back to this? Did you not work another day after May 68?
Not another day. No. I mean, the place, as far as I knew. I mean, communications were difficult. This is a thing. You can't stress enough. The house the flat where I lived, or rather the room in the flat where I lived, had a telephone, but I wasn't allowed to use it. Shall I mention my landlady? She was extreme far right and took Rivarol, which of course still exists. It's a far right newspaper, appears every week. She and her daughter hated me, and her daughter was in sort of middle age. She loved the Germans, everything about the Germans, presumably the occupation too, and she hated the British. And the landlady herself, oh no, it was the daughter in fact, said this about de Gaulle. And this is all through the year before anything actually happened. C'est un sale coco, monsieur. Il a été payé par les Russes depuis 1940. He is a dirty communist who's been paid by the Russians since 1940. So de Gaulle was a communist. So when, of course, the revolution came, as it were, or the failed revolution, he put them up to it. You know, and every day she said, "I told you so. He's a communist. You can see it." This was a sort of comic under the current to everything that was happening. Obviously, I didn't believe a word, but you know, they got it sussed. You know, they'd worked it out. It was de Gaulle's plan. Of course, when he went off to Baden-Baden and all that, you know, it was QED.
You've had quite an experience there, I would say. Those people. How did you? So when things come to a conclusion, then how did you feel? Were you relieved, disappointed? How did you live through those summer months?
Well, I think like everybody, I got a bit bored of the hardship. You know, I think the general population, when it's been going on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, and you know the shops are not what you want, and you can't travel anywhere, and so on, you get a bit fed up, and I was a bit fed up. And trekking, in order to meet anybody at all, trekking across Paris, you know, 5 miles this way, 5 miles back. It was a great relief in the end when I got out. And I got out, I think, I tell you how. Word got around somehow, even though we'd not got mobiles or tablets or whatever, word got around that Skyways International, dear old Skyways International, which was the craziest sort of wooden string service you could ever imagine. It used to fly. You'd go from Victoria to Lymm or Lydd on the south coast. You'd fly in a wartime Dakota DC-3 across to Beauvais, which, as you know, is about 50 miles north of Paris. You'd get on a coach, and you'd end up in the Place de la République. And the whole thing, it was very cheap, and it worked. So, you know, I got a bit addicted to Skyways. And dear old Skyways got things moving again somehow. It was Wednesday the 29th of May, I went across to Place de la République, I think with one of my pals, and booked a ticket, and the very next day I was out of there. But it was not the usual arrangement. We were taken by coach to K Military Airport and guarded by guys with machine guns. It was all pretty. I can see me now standing at the entrance to a hangar with the guys with guns, you know. And then finally, you could have wept for joy. This beautiful Hawker Siddeley propeller plane comes out of the sky, and on we got. And in no time, we were back on the south coast of England. I never, you know, I could have kissed the ground really. And of course, England was utterly untouched. You know, yes, I could have made a papal gesture as I got off at Lymm. And I stayed overnight. A poor friend of mine had no idea, of course, again, no telephones, no tablets or whatever. A friend of mine who's in a hall of residence in London let me stay overnight sleeping on his floor. And that was very decent of him, because I rocked up at about 10:30 in the evening. Yeah, I went back again about 2 weeks later when things were allegedly quieter. They weren't, in fact, because I went back with my fiancée, now my wife, in the other room. We've been married 47 years. We went back, and this is when I saw the guy at the school. And there were still riots, and we were caught up with in tear gas. We were chased. We took refuge in the metro, but tear gas seeps down the stairs, and you know, it was unpleasant. It smelled like hair drops. Yeah. I had a friend who used to collect tear gas canisters, by the way. They're a bit like sort of little brick cans. And I slept on his floor at the Cité Universitaire, and the next day I was in tears. I'd been crying all night. He'd got them in a plastic bag. Sorry, I'm digressing.
No, it's an interesting collection. Just a couple of questions about some of the characteristics we normally associate with this period. So, often discussed is the attempt by students to get some contact going with workers. Did you feel as though that went on? Did you experience any of that? Was it a success?
Um, it obviously wasn't a success because of the general strike. I know the Maoists were reaching out, and didn't South go out and talk to the workers at some length? I think, as he always did. I've forgotten where it was, or what one of the factories. No, I mean I was not close enough to it to know anything other than what the radio told me. And of course, I didn't believe what the radio said. I used to listen to the Station Périphérique as well, you know, where you thought it might be less government orientated. No, no special knowledge really of that.
Okay, one of the other sort of dominant characteristics when talking about this period is this notion of la prise de parole, the sense that somehow in May everybody started speaking to each other, whether that was in occupied factories, occupied schools, occupied universities. Is that something that you experienced yourself?
Other than in, you know, sort of formal meeting, as it were, I went to the Sorbonne, and I went down a staircase, a spiral staircase, which had huge letters, tristesse written on the side, which is lovely, and dismal, dull, sadness, you know. And I listened to, I think it was the English faculty, debating endlessly, where do we go now, what should happen. Yes, it was amazing and people were just, you know, would stand up from the audience and take the microphone and talk for half an hour. You know, it was that kind of situation. Yes, people really were talking to each other, ditto at the Odeon. But I mean, that's really my only experience of it, that students, the ones who were directly involved, were indeed talking.
And were they talking about revolution, or were they talking about reform?
Difficult to say, really. I mean, some were revolutionaries and some were reformists. You know, a mix. That's the only honest answer, really.
That's fair. That's fair. You mentioned earlier, you mentioned briefly earlier about the police. What was your experience of the police conduct, the level of violence? Would you describe '68 as a violent revolt?
Yeah, it's very violent. Yes. Sorry, I don't know what was going on there. Yes, it was. It certainly was violent. I didn't like the police. None of us did. I certainly didn't like the CRS. And I went to a meeting outside the Sorbonne where the CRS were lined up in front of the Sorbonne, and somebody said in the background, "Ce sont des gens très peu évolués." People have not evolved very much, you know, as if they were cavemen. They looked like farm workers, you know, or whatever. They looked pretty tough guys that you wouldn't want to mess with. And I was chased around a few times by them, so, you know, unwillingly, unwittingly. So yeah, I had a strong sense that there was a lot of tension between the police in its various forms and the populace, and certainly with the students. And this, I mean, all I had to measure it by was England. There'd been demonstrations. You remember the Grosvenor Square demonstration the previous March, you know, and the police had gone on their horses and chased people around, and there'd been some violence. But generally speaking, England was, and probably still is, a pretty placid place. I mean, political violence is the norm, you know, from zero to nuclear in a very short time, you know, and the power of the, I suppose, I don't want to call it the mob, the crowd, groups of people who just go for it, you know, from, you know, they're not happy, so they set fire to a few tires, or they throw a Molotov cocktail at the policeman, or whatever, you know, that was my impression. Very, very different. France was a very different country, and it felt very far away from England, as it was in a sense then.
Yeah. Was there any sense at the time that this was a set of events or a crisis that existed beyond Paris? I mean, from
I mean, I know things did go on in other places, and all I heard was what was going on in the radio, you know, and they would say there's been a demonstration in, I don't know, Besançon or somewhere like that. I was aware that there were things going on in other cities, but obviously didn't impinge on me. Things were already bad enough in Paris, you know. It was a sort of relief to know that the misery was shared, but that, you know, that's all I can say. And afterwards, of course, I did learn from when I got back and eventually met all the other folk who'd been teaching in French schools. I realised it had gone on in other places. You know, yes. I've seen all the films, by the way, Milou en Mai and, you know, Après Mai and all that. And so some are quite good, I have to say.
Some are not so good.
The Dreamers.
Beyond the sort of national paradigm, and I suppose as an international student or someone from outside of France, you may have been aware of this. Was there any sense that this was part of something that was going on more internationally? Because, as I'm sure you're aware, France isn't the only country to be experiencing upheaval at this period, during this period.
Yeah, I mean, it was, well, you remember the famous article, La France s'ennuie in Le Monde. You know, France is bored and young people are not doing anything, and in other countries, in France, in America, of course, in Germany, things are happening. I was very much aware of that, obviously. And maybe there was a desire to catch up on the part of French students. I really don't know. I know how important America was and is for the French, you know, whether they admit it or not. And, you know, so, I mean, so much of what's happened since 68, you know, has been 68 being exported to America, you know, Marcuse and Foucault and all the rest of the guys, and then re-imported into Europe. I don't know, that's just a theory. But yes, I was aware there were other dimensions to what was happening.
Okay, what was your view at the time on the way in which the events had been handled by the political elite? So, De Gaulle, Pompidou, Mitterrand, Mendes France, that sort of.
They were completely taken off guard. You know, I think they were. They didn't quite realise what was going on. That was clear from the start. The Communist Party had no idea what was going on or how to handle it. I mean, Georges Marchais, you know, old Stalinist, I think he caught up eventually, but there was a lot of catching up, and I don't think a lot of people did. It was something that the classe politique was, I think, overwhelmed by and didn't know quite how to handle.
What about De Gaulle? What did you think of De Gaulle in particular?
We all disliked him to a man and woman because he just told us we couldn't join the common market. Where's the irony there? And of course there were people who disliked the Brits, a traditional, among some people, to the traditional dislike of the Brits. And he seemed to represent it. He was the incarnation of the French being awkward or difficult with us. There were a lot of people, I have to say, amongst those who didn't think he was a communist, paid by the Russians. There was a lot of pro-Gaullist feeling, you know, amongst teachers and so on. And indeed amongst the études commerciales, these guys who were about 18 and going off into business. France was doing reasonably well, and I think he had a lot of people on his side. I mean, eventually he didn't, you know, it was how far the events brought about his downfall, it's difficult to say.
You mentioned Baden earlier, the episode when he disappears for the day. Can you recall what happened there, or what you thought? Or
I think I was probably on the plane by then. It was quite late on. I mean, I really don't know.
Nobody any consolation.
Sorry?
Nobody seems to know, really. There's still a debate about whether.
Yeah, I gather. I'm not a historian, obviously, but I will tell you this, that there were rumors that there were tank maneuvers going on to the north of Paris. And also that there were tanks hidden in the backyards of prefecture, police stations, under tarpaulin. And that was very much in my mind, and it was very worrying, if this turned into a shooting war, my goodness, we could all be dead. But of course, that didn't happen. But it was always a possibility that there would be a military coup d'etat. So yeah, the rumor mill, really. The way he went off to Romania was pretty extraordinary, I have to say. It was just a couple of days after the Nuit des Barricades. I mean, he must have felt pretty confident that he could get away with it. And that seemed very surprising. He'd also, I think, perhaps his behaviour prolonged things. I don't know.
It's certainly a valid argument. Can you recall how your parents or your friends felt about things, whether it was during the events or just when you managed to escape at the end of May?
My poor parents, well, my wife in the other room, then my fiancée was a student in London. And I, of course, had no phone, but I beseeched the Rivarol reading landlady to let me ring her. There was a phone in the building she had a room in, to let her know I was still alive and I was okay. And the phone was working, the international system was working. And I spoke to her. She was in tears. I said, "Oh, I'm fine, sort of fine. And could you let my parents know?" Who weren't on the phone, but she could ring my dad at his office. So yeah, again, this problem of communications comes back again and again. How slow, how difficult communications were then. But yeah, they were worried about me. They could see it all on television. I knew what was on the BBC because I was listening to it. And yeah, they're obviously very relieved when I got back. I think it was my 21st actually, that July. Yeah, sorry, go on.
That's fair. No, that's fair. So, how did you perceive the impact of these events on France at the time? And has that perspective changed as time has passed in a more long-term perspective?
Nothing sort of happens immediately. Things went back to normal. There were, I think, post-mortems. Gradually, I think the education system changed. I think it loosened up a lot. I mean, there was a loosening up after '68 that you became aware of. How this happened, how can we improve things? There was certainly a loosening up, I think, of attitudes to sexual morality. I remember there was a saying that 68 a vidé les séminaires, that 68 emptied the seminaries, that young men were just not wanting to be priests anymore, and whether this was to do with the ongoing sexual revolution, I don't know. But yes, it was, I think there was gradually became aware that things, rien n'est plus comme avant, that things would never be the same. It was not, it was a revolution manquée, obviously, but it did gradually, and probably because it was bounced back from America as well to some extent, as so many things are. I think it did change things. Less family-orientated, society. Sorry.
You think it changed things for the better?
Depends what your point of view is, doesn't it, really? I mean, looking from 2016, whether the sexual revolution was such a great thing, again, it's your point of view, isn't it? I think it's a good thing that people started talking to each other perhaps a bit more than they had before. Attitude between students and staff and school pupils and teachers loosened up a bit. Perhaps it's loosened up too much. Perhaps discipline has been lost. I was in this, as I said, rather 1950s lycée where there was never a problem.
Did these events, in your experience of these events, inflect or have an impact on your understanding of France?
Yes, in as much as when you've seen extreme violence, in the possibility of unexpected violence, political violence, I mean, happening. Yet when you've seen it, you don't forget it. I mean, we've had, over the years in Britain, football violence and so on. But this, for political reasons, to suddenly, as I said, go nuclear, that was new. That was new. And when earlier this year things were moving in that general direction, I was not surprised in France. They didn't get that far, but yes, that was a lesson.
Did 1968 have an impact on you personally, politically?
Not really. I came back as Howard Wilson and Labour Party as I've gone. No, I can't say so. I think, and the sight of violence and the sight of destruction, seeing all those trees cut down, you don't have to be an ecologist to feel sorry for the total devastation, I have to say, wanton devastation that I saw, however good the cause. I don't like political violence. That's probably a long-lasting effect on me.
Okay. Do you think that these events and your experience of them affected your scholarship on France or French history, French literature, whatever?
No, other than that, I'd seen a quasi-revolution. When you read about 1848 in L'Éducation sentimentale, or whatever, when you read about 1789 and the power of the mob, and how uncontrollable, crowds can be, I suppose it simply underlined what I already knew there. Yes.
Okay. I suppose as someone who experienced the events and obviously has a keen interest in France, has kept one eye on how the way the story has been told, the story of 1968 has been told over the years, how that's changed and evolved. And I wondered if you had a view on to what extent you feel the dominant narrative around 1968 truly captures what happened or your experience of it.
I'm not quite sure what the dominant narrative is, to be absolutely honest. I can only repeat that this was something sudden and unexpected. It was like an earthquake, but without pre-shocks, pre-tremors. There really was nothing to tell you what was going to happen. And it seemed to acquire a momentum of its own. It snowballed. And you see this in many events around the world since then. Suddenly the thing just took off. And that my only contribution would be to say that it was unexpected. I don't think I can say more than that about it, really. It was unexpected, it was violent. I was glad to get away from it.
Well, if I was to say that maybe the dominant narrative could be summarized in 3 words, being Paris, May, and student, do you think that that's a fair representation of what?
That's fair enough. Yeah, that's absolutely fair enough. Yes, yes. We forget, I tend to forget. It was there were moments of great humor. The poster art was absolutely fabulous. And I never forget when de Gaulle, when he made the speech in which he said nothing, and he talked about une jeunesse qui s'inquiète trop souvent, young people who worry too often. And immediately there was a poster of a young person with a gag around his face. There was a lot of humor, a lot of wit. It was very jokey. It was very young. It was a very young person's thing. And then, of course, it ceased to be, when it turned into a general strike and generalized misery, I suppose. Yes, there's a long tradition obviously political violence in France, and I suppose that fitted into it. It was just the students doing it this time.
Okay, and then one last question, which is something I've asked everyone to try and do, is if you were given 30 seconds, how would you summarize your experience of the 1968 events, and how would you summarize this period, I suppose?
It was exciting. It was incredibly vivid. It's haut en couleur. It was very brightly coloured. It affected me to the extent that I still think about it. I wrote a novel about it on Kindle. It stayed with me. It's not a thing I would care to go through again, but I'm very glad I did go through it.